Nobody knew who he was. To the flight crew of Summit Air Flight 902, he was just an obstacle. A man in a hoodie sitting in a seat they didn't think he deserved. They thought they could bully him. They thought they could humiliate him. They thought they could drag him off the plane and erase the problem. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They didn't check the manifest, and they certainly didn't check his net worth. When Julian Kincaid was forced onto the jet bridge, he didn't scream and he didn't fight. He just made one phone call. And 45 minutes later, Summit Air wasn't just missing a passenger. They were fighting for their existence. This is the story of how one act of prejudice grounded an entire fleet and cost an airline $3 billion in a single afternoon. The rain was hammering against the reinforced glass of Terminal 4 at JFK International Airport. It was one of those grey, miserable New York afternoons, where the humidity makes everyone's temper a little shorter, and the air inside the terminal feels recycled and heavy. Julian Kincaid adjusted the strap of his worn leather duffel bag on his shoulder. He was exhausted. It had been a 40-hour week of negotiations in Tokyo, followed by a red-eye to New York, and now, finally, he was heading home to London. He wasn't dressed for the occasion of first-class travel, or at least not by the standards of the 1950s. He wore a charcoal grey hoodie, slightly oversized black joggers, and a pair of pristine, limited-edition sneakers that probably cost more than the Honda Civic parked outside the terminal. But, to the unobservant eye, he looked like a college student, or perhaps an off-duty athlete trying to stay low profile. He approached the gate for Summit Air Flight 902. He loved the anonymity. At 34 years old, Julian was the quiet architect behind Kincaid & Sterling, a private equity firm that specialized in hostile takeovers and distress management. He didn't wear suits unless he was closing a deal. He didn't wear watches that flashed. He preferred to be the ghost in the room. Boarding Group 1. The gate agent announced, her voice crackling over the intercom. Julian moved forward, his digital boarding pass ready on his phone. He scanned it. The machine beeped a satisfying green, and he walked down the jet bridge. The cool air of the cabin hit him as he stepped onto the plane. He turned left, heading toward seat 2A. The first-class cabin of the Summit Air Boeing 707 was the jewel of their fleet. Diamond-stitched leather gold accents, private suites with sliding doors. It was opulence designed to make you forget you were hurtling through the stratosphere in a metal tube. Julian found 2A, tossed his duffel into the overhead bin, and collapsed into the seat. He didn't want champagne. He didn't want warm nuts. He just wanted to sleep. He pulled his noise-cancelling headphones over his ears, closed his eyes and exhaled. That was when he felt the tap on his shoulder. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a sharp, insistent poke. Julian slid one ear cup back and looked up. Standing over him was the purser, the head flight attendant. Her name tag read Brenda. She had a hairstyle that looked like it had been sprayed with concrete and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were scanning him not with hospitality, but with suspicion. "Sir," Brenda said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet veneer, "I think you might be in the wrong seat. Economy boarding is through the galley and to the right." Julian blinked, fighting the fatigue. "I'm in 2A. This is 2A. May I see your boarding pass, please?" She held out her hand, snapping her fingers slightly as if expecting him to fumble. Julian sighed, pulled his phone out again, and held up the screen. Julian Kincaid, seat 2A, first class, priority. Brenda stared at the screen for a long time, longer than necessary. She looked at the name, then looked at Julian's hoodie, then back at the phone. She frowned, as if the device had personally insulted her. "I need to check this against my manifest," she said curtly. "Wait here." She didn't say, "Please wait here." She walked away toward the galley, her heels clicking aggressively on the floor. Julian watched her go. He was used to this. It was the tax of appearance. If you were young and black and rich, you had to prove it twice as often as a white man in a cheap suit. He put his headphones back on. 5 minutes passed. The plane was filling up. Passengers in business suits and designer dresses were filing past, glancing at Julian. Some looked curious. Others looked annoyed, as if his presence devalued their own ticket. Brenda returned. She wasn't alone. She had brought backup. A second flight attendant, a younger man named Todd, stood behind her, arms crossed. "Mr. Kincaid," Brenda said, pronouncing his name as if it were a question. "There seems to be a discrepancy with your ticket." Julian took off his headphones entirely this time. The cabin had gone quiet. The couple in 1A and 1B were watching openly now. "A discrepancy?" Julian asked, his voice calm, deep and steady. "I bought this ticket 2 weeks ago. Full fare. No points. The system is showing that this seat was flagged for a system error." Brenda lied. It was a bad lie. Her eyes flickered to the entrance of the plane, where a heavy-set man in a loud navy suit was standing looking impatient. He was tapping his watch. He looked like exactly the kind of platinum status frequent flyer who complained if his scotch wasn't poured to the rim. "The seat is double booked," Brenda continued, her voice hardening. "And we have a Diamond Medallion member, Mr. Halloway, who is assigned to this seat. Since his status takes priority in the event of a system glitch, we're going to need you to deplane." Julian looked at Mr. Halloway, standing by the door. He looked back at Brenda. "Deplane," Julian repeated. "You're not asking me to move seats. You're asking me to leave the aircraft." "The flight is fully booked, sir. We have no other seats in first or business, and economy is oversold. We can put you on the next flight to London tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning?" Julian said, a dry laugh escaping his lips. "I have a board meeting in London at 9:00 a.m. I'm not taking a flight tomorrow." "Then you can take a refund." Brenda snapped, her patience evaporating. "But you cannot stay in this seat. Mr. Halloway is waiting." "Mr. Halloway can wait," Julian said, leaning back and buckling his seatbelt. The click was loud in the silent cabin. "I paid $12,000 for this seat. I'm not moving." Brenda's face turned a blotchy shade of red. She leaned in close, invading his personal space. "Sir, if you do not vacate this seat voluntarily, I will have you removed. Do not make a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Brenda," Julian said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. You are the one making a scene to accommodate a friend." Brenda straightened up, her jaw tight. She turned to Todd. "Get the captain." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted from awkward to hostile. The air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Mr. Halloway, the man waiting for the seat, had pushed his way into the cabin and was now standing near the galley, huffing loudly. "What is the hold-up?" Halloway boomed. "I have a connection to make in London." Brenda held up a hand to him, whispering something reassuring, then turned her glare back to the cockpit door. It opened. Captain Greg Hansen stepped out. He was a tall man, with silver hair and 4 stripes on his shoulder. He had the swagger of a man who was used to his word being law at 35,000 feet. He didn't look happy to be out of his cockpit. He adjusted his hat and looked at Julian. He didn't look at Julian's face. He looked at the hoodie. The judgment was instantaneous. "What's the problem here?" Captain Hansen asked, his voice booming. He refuses to deplane, Captain, Brenda said, playing the victim perfectly. He's become belligerent. I don't feel safe with him on board. Julian's eyebrows shot up. Belligerent. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't stood up. He hadn't cursed. Sir, the captain said, stepping into Julian's row. You are interfering with flight crew duties. That is a federal offense. You need to grab your bag and get off my aircraft. Now. Julian looked at the captain. Captain, I am a revenue passenger. I have a valid boarding pass. Your purser is trying to bump me for that man over there because he has a higher loyalty status. That is a violation of your own carriage contract. You cannot involuntarily deplane a boarded passenger for a status upgrade. The captain's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being cited policy by a man in a hoodie. I am the captain. I decide who flies and who doesn't. And right now I'm deciding you don't fly. You're disrupting the peace. I'm sitting quietly, Julian countered. Ask the other passengers. Have I raised my voice? Julian looked across the aisle at the woman in 2D. She looked away quickly, unwilling to get involved. Cowardice was contagious in tight spaces. I'm not holding a pole, son. The captain spat. I'm giving you an order. If you don't move in 30 seconds, I'm calling the Port Authority police. And they won't ask you nicely. They'll drag you out and you'll leave this airport in handcuffs. Is that what you want? Julian felt a cold rage settling in his stomach. It was a familiar feeling, one he had felt in boardrooms when people underestimated him. But this was more primal. This was physical. Call them, Julian said softly. The captain blinked. He hadn't expected that. Excuse me. Call the police, Julian repeated. If you're going to remove me, let's do it by the book. I want a police report. I want your name, her name, and a record of exactly why I'm being removed. Captain Hansen's face went purple. He grabbed the interphone handset on the wall and barked into it. Tower, this is Summit 902, requesting LEOs at the gate immediately. We have a non-compliant passenger refusing to deplane. The cabin murmured. People were pulling out their phones now. Julian saw the camera lenses peeking over the seatbacks. Good. Let them film. You're making a big mistake, Captain, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. You have no idea who is sitting in this seat. I know exactly who is sitting there, Hansen sneered. A troublemaker. The wait for the police was excruciating. Mr. Halloway was now loudly complaining on his cell phone, pacing back and forth. Yes, some thug is holding up the flight. Unbelievable. No, they're getting the cops. Thug. Julian stored that word away. He catalogued it alongside belligerent and non-compliant. Every insult was a line item on the invoice he was about to write. 3 officers from the Port Authority Police Department, PAPD, boarded the plane. They looked serious, hands resting near their belts. The lead officer, a burly man named Officer Kowalski, looked at the captain. This the guy? Kowalski asked, jerking his chin toward Julian. That's him, Brenda said, pointing a manicured finger. He's been threatening us. That is a lie, Julian said firmly. Officer, I have valid passage. They are trying to give my seat to their friend. This is a civil contract dispute, not a criminal matter. Kowalski looked at Julian. To his credit, the officer hesitated. He saw a calm man, not a threat. But the captain of an aircraft has absolute authority. If the pilot says, you go, you go. Look, buddy, Kowalski said, his tone reasonable but firm. The captain wants you off. Once he says that your ticket doesn't matter anymore. You're trespassing. You have to come with us. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Julian looked at the 3 officers. Then he looked at Brenda, who was smirking, then at Captain Hansen, who was checking his watch, then at Mr. Halloway, who was grinning like he'd just won a prize. Julian slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. "I'll come," Julian said, "but I want everyone to remember this moment. I want you to remember that I gave you a chance to do the right thing." "Save the speech," Hansen muttered. "Get off my plane." Julian stood up. He grabbed his duffel bag. He didn't look down. He walked into the aisle, towering over Brenda. For a second, she looked scared, realizing just how tall he was. But he simply stepped around her. As he walked past Mr. Halloway, the man muttered, "About time." Julian stopped. He turned to Halloway. "Enjoy the seat, Mr. Halloway," Julian said. "It's going to be the most expensive seat you ever sat in." Julian walked up the jet bridge, flanked by the police officers. The heavy door of the aircraft slammed shut behind him. He could hear the distinct sound of the locking mechanism. They had sealed their fate. The walk back up the jet bridge was a gauntlet of shame, even though Julian had done nothing wrong. The police officers escorted him out into the terminal, the bright fluorescent lights of JFK stinging his eyes. A crowd had gathered at the gate area, other passengers waiting for later flights, onlookers drawn by the sight of police. They whispered and pointed. To them, he was just another unruly passenger, probably drunk or violent. "We're going to need to see some ID, write up a report," Officer Kowalski said, once they were clear of the gate. He led Julian to a row of plastic seats near the window, away from the prying eyes of the crowd. Julian handed over his British passport and his New York driver's license. Kowalski looked at the passport, then at the license, then at Julian. He ran the name through his radio. "Dispatch check on a Julian Kincaid, DOB 10/12/1989. There was a crackle of static and then a pause. A long pause. "Status is clear, Kowalski. No priors. No warrants. Actually. Hold on." The dispatcher's voice changed tone. "Is this the Julian Kincaid connected to K&S Holdings?" Kowalski looked at Julian. "You work for K&S." "I own it." Julian corrected his voice, flat. Kowalski's eyes widened slightly. He handed the documents back, his demeanor shifting instantly from authoritative to apologetic. He knew what K&S was. Everyone in New York finance knew K&S. They were the firm that had just bailed out half the city's infrastructure projects. "Look, Mr. Kincaid," Kowalski said, lowering his voice. "The airline has the right to refuse service. It's their property. But between you and me, that captain was a jerk. You weren't being violent. I'm writing this up as a civil dispute, no arrest. You're free to go." "Thank you, officer," Julian said. "I'll need that incident number. I'll text it to you." The officers left. Julian was alone. He sat on the hard plastic chair, watching the rain streak the window. Outside, he could see the nose of the Summit Air Boeing 707. The pushback tug was already hooking up to the landing gear. They were preparing to leave. They were preparing to fly to London with Mr. Halloway, sipping champagne in seat 2A. Julian reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out his personal iPhone. He reached into the inner pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a sleek, matte black satellite phone, a device used for secure, high-level communications that couldn't be tapped or traced easily. He dialed a single number. It rang once. "Julian." The voice on the other end was crisp, British, and sounded like it was sitting in a leather chair in Mayfair. It was Arthur Sterling, his partner, and the co-founder of Kincaid and Sterling. "Arthur," Julian said, "I'm not making the meeting tomorrow." "Why flight delayed?" "Deplaned," Julian said. "Involuntarily. Summit Air decided I didn't look the part for first class. They gave my seat to a Diamond Medallion member." There was a silence on the line. A silence that was colder than the air conditioning in the terminal. When Arthur spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. "They kicked you off." "The purser." "Brenda and the captain, Greg Hansen. They called the police on me, Arthur. I was escorted off in front of the entire terminal." "Summit Air." Arthur mused, the sound of typing clicking furiously in the background. "That's interesting. Aren't we holding the paper on their Series B restructuring?" "We are," Julian said, his eyes fixed on the plane outside as it began to move. "We hold 40% of their senior secured debt, and we control the revolving credit facility that covers their daily fuel and ground operations." "I'm looking at the covenant agreement right now," Arthur said. "Section 14, Clause B. The lender reserves the right to freeze credit lines immediately upon any material adverse event or loss of confidence in management." "I have lost confidence in the management," Julian said. "Specifically, their risk assessment capabilities." "Understood," Arthur said. "What do you want to do, Julian?" "We can file a lawsuit tomorrow. We can bury them in legal fees for a decade." "No," Julian said. "A lawsuit takes too long, and they're flying away. I don't want them to fly away." "Okay," Arthur said slowly. "You want the nuclear option? Execute the liquidity freeze," Julian commanded. "Cut the credit line. Notify the fuel suppliers, the ground handlers, and the airport authorities that Summit Air is currently in default, and that Kincaid and Sterling will not guarantee any further payments as of—" Julian checked his watch. 1 minute ago. "Julian, if we do that, their operations halt. Globally. It's a cascading failure. We're talking about stranding thousands of passengers." "No," Julian corrected. "We are stranding one passenger. Me. The rest is just collateral damage of their own incompetence. Do it, Arthur, and send the notice of default directly to the CEO, Jonathan Reed. Mark it Urgent Insolvency Event." "With pleasure," Arthur said. "Give me 10 minutes." Julian hung up. He didn't leave the airport. He didn't call an Uber. He sat there, crossed his legs, and watched the plane. Flight 902 was taxiing toward the runway. It was third in line for takeoff. Go ahead, Julian thought. Try to leave. Inside the cockpit of Flight 902, Captain Hansen was feeling good. He had regained control of his ship. The problem was back in the terminal, and they were only 20 minutes behind schedule. He could make that up in the air with a good tailwind. Tower Summit 902 ready for departure, runway 4. Left. Hansen radioed, his voice smooth and confident. Summit 902 hold short of runway 4 left. Traffic incoming, the controller replied. Holding short, Hansen said. He turned to his first officer, a younger pilot named Evans. See, you have to be firm with these people. You let one rule slide and the whole cabin turns into a zoo. Yes, sir, Evans said, though he looked uneasy. Did we really have to call the cops, though? He seemed calm. It's about respect, Evans. He didn't respect the uniform. Suddenly, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, ACARs, screened the text messaging system pilots use to communicate with their airline's dispatch, lit up with a red message. Priority message. Dispatch to FLT 902. Hansen frowned. What now? He clicked the message open. It wasn't a weather update. It wasn't a routing change. It was a single confusing command. Message immediate. Stop. Return to gate. Do not take off. Company operations suspended. Operations suspended, Hansen muttered. What the hell does that mean? Before he could process it, the radio crackled. The voice from the air traffic control tower was no longer the bored, rhythmic cadence of a controller. It was urgent. Summit 902 Kennedy Tower. Cancel takeoff clearance. I repeat, cancel takeoff clearance. Hansen grabbed the mic. Tower Summit 902 say reason. We are next in line. Summit 902, we just got a call from Port Authority and your own dispatch. Your flight plan has been revoked. Your insurance has been flagged as void. You are not legal to fly, Captain. Clear the runway immediately. Exit taxiway, Bravo. Hansen felt a cold bead of sweat trickle down his back. Insurance void, flight plan revoked. That didn't happen. That only happened if an airline went bust. Instantly. At Summit Air Headquarters, Dallas, Texas. The Operations Control Center, OCC of Summit Air, usually looked like NASA walls of screens, tracking hundreds of flights across the globe. Usually it was a hum of organized chaos. Right now, it was a funeral parlor. Jonathan Reed, the CEO of Summit Air, burst into the room. He was still wearing his golf polo. He had been pulled off the 9th hole by his frantic CFO. "What is going on?" Reed screamed. "Why is my phone blowing up? Why is Shell Aviation telling me our fuel cards are declined in London, Tokyo and New York?" The director of operations. A woman named Sarah looked pale. She held up a tablet. "Sir, we just received a formal notice of default from our primary lender, Kincaid and Sterling." Reed froze. "K&S, why we made our interest payment last week." "It's not a missed payment, sir," Sarah said, reading the email with trembling hands. "They cited a material breach of conduct and reputational risk. They've exercised the immediate call clause on the $400 million revolving credit line. They've frozen our accounts." "On what grounds?" Reed yelled. "What reputational risk?" Sarah swiped to the next attachment in the email. It was a police incident report from JFK Airport, time-stamped 30 minutes ago. Attached to it was a cell phone photo taken by a passenger. It showed a black man in a hoodie being led off a Summit airplane by police. The subject of the incident, Sarah whispered, was Julian Kincaid. Reed felt the blood drain from his face. Kincaid. As in the K in K&S. "Yes, sir. He was a passenger on Flight 902. Our crew kicked him off." Reed grabbed the nearest desk to steady himself. The room spun. His flight crew had just kicked the man who owned their debt off his own airplane. "Get Flight 902 on the phone," Reed whispered. "Now." "We can't just call the plane, sir. They're taxiing," Sarah said. "I don't care if they are on the moon. Stop that plane. If that plane takes off, Kincaid destroys us. He'll liquidate the assets before they land. We need to get him back on that plane, and we need to do it 10 minutes ago." Back at JFK, Terminal 4, Julian was still sitting in the plastic chair. He watched the massive Boeing 707 stop on the tarmac. It sat there for a long minute. Then slowly, painfully, it began to turn. It wasn't taking off. It was taxiing back. Julian's phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. Area code 214, Dallas. He let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again immediately. He let it go to voicemail again. He watched the plane crawling back toward the gate. It looked like a beaten dog returning to its master. The gate agent, a kind woman named Maria, who had watched the whole deplaning in silence, looked at her computer screen. Her jaw dropped. She looked up at Julian, then back at the screen. The phone on her desk rang. She picked it up, listened, and turned even paler. She hung up and walked over to Julian. Mr. Kincaid, she said, her voice shaking. Yes, Maria. That was the CEO of the airline. Mr. Reed. I assume he wants to talk. He says he is personally authorizing a refund of your ticket plus $10,000 in compensation, and he is ordering the plane to return to the gate to pick you up. He wants to apologize. Julian smiled. It was a shark's smile. Tell Mr. Reed, Julian said calmly, that I am not interested in a refund, and I am not interested in getting back on that plane. I have already booked a seat on British Airways. Their flight leaves in 2 hours. Sir, he says if you don't get back on the flight, the bank is going to shut down the airline. Julian stood up. He picked up his duffel bag. That sounds like a Summit Air problem, not a Julian Kincaid problem. Wait, Maria cried out. The plane is here. Look! The 707 had pulled back into the gate. The jet bridge was extending. The door opened. Captain Hansen came storming out, looking furious and confused. He saw Julian standing there. You, Hansen barked, marching up the jet bridge. What did you do? Dispatch ordered us back. They say you cancelled the flight. Julian looked down at the captain. The power dynamic had fully inverted. I didn't cancel the flight, Captain, Julian said smoothly. I just cancelled the credit card that pays for your gas. Hansen stared at him, mouth agape. Who are you? I'm the discrepancy, Julian said. I'm the system error. Remember. Julian turned his back on the captain, the plane, and the panicked gate agents. He began to walk away toward the British Airways terminal. But the drama wasn't over. Because Mr. Halloway, the man who had stolen his seat, was now stomping up the jet bridge behind the captain, red-faced and screaming, "Why are we back at the gate? I have a meeting!" Julian stopped. He turned around one last time. "Mr. Halloway," Julian called out across the terminal. "You might want to check the news. I don't think you're going to make that meeting." Julian walked away, but he didn't leave the airport. He had one more stop to make. He needed to visit the British Airways lounge, have a glass of actual champagne, and watch the stock market open. Because in about 20 minutes, Summit Air's stock was going to hit zero. The chaos at JFK Terminal 4 was no longer contained to gate B32. It was spreading like a virus. When Julian Kincaid walked away, he didn't just leave a stunned captain and an angry passenger. He left a ticking time bomb. Within 15 minutes of his phone call to Arthur Sterling, the effects of the liquidity freeze began to ripple through the airport's nervous system. It started with the fuel trucks. The driver of the tanker truck, hooked up to Summit Air Flight 902, received a message on his datapad. Authorization denied. Do not dispense. He unhooked the hose, climbed into his cab, and drove away, leaving the massive Boeing 707 thirsty and stranded. Then came the ground crew, the baggage handlers who were midway through loading the cargo for the next flight, stopped. Their union rep had just received a call. Summit Air's payroll account had been flagged. No pay, no play. They walked off the tarmac, leaving carts of luggage sitting in the rain. Inside the plane, the temperature was rising literally and metaphorically. The engines were off, and without the ground power unit, which had also been disconnected due to non-payment, the air conditioning died. Captain Hansen stood in the cockpit, screaming into his radio. Dispatch. We are losing power. I need a fuel truck. What is going on? Captain. The dispatcher's voice was bleak. We can't send anyone. The vendors have blacklisted us. They say our credit is no good. We can't pay them. Hansen slumped into his seat. He looked out the window. He saw the British Airways 747, the one Julian Kincaid was now sitting on, push back from the gate next door. It taxied past them, massive and majestic. Hansen could almost feel the mockery in the roar of its engines. Back in the cabin, the passengers were revolting. "Why is it so hot? Why aren't we moving? Who was that guy the cops took off?" In seat 3C, a 19-year-old college student named Leo had been recording everything. He had filmed Brenda's snarky attitude. He had filmed the captain's arrogance. He had filmed Julian's calm departure. And he had filmed the subsequent announcement that the flight was cancelled due to operational issues. Leo did what any 19-year-old would do. He opened TikTok. He stitched the clips together with a caption, "Summit Air kicks off billionaire owner of their debt for a random guy. Now the whole airline is bankrupt. Karma is real." He hit post. The video hit 100,000 views in 10 minutes, 1 million views in an hour. By the time Julian's British Airways flight reached cruising altitude Hahant Summit Air, racist and billionaire clapback were the #1 and 2 trends on Twitter worldwide. Inside the first-class cabin of the grounded Summit plane, Mr. Halloway was sweating through his suit. The other passengers had figured it out. They had seen the news on their phones before the Wi-Fi cut out. "It's because of him," a woman in 4B pointed at Halloway. "They kicked that young man off to give him the seat, and that young man just shut down the airline." Halloway shrank into his stolen seat. "I didn't know," he protested, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I just wanted my upgrade." "Well, congratulations," the woman snapped. "You got your upgrade. Now none of us are going to London." Brenda the purser was hiding in the galley. She was scrolling through Twitter, reading the comments on her own behavior. "Fire Brenda. Who is that flight attendant? She needs to be in jail. Summit Air is done." She felt sick. She looked at the captain, who was stepping out of the cockpit, looking defeated. "Captain," she whispered, "what do we do?" "We deplane," Hansen said, his voice hollow. "Everyone off. The flight is cancelled. The airline might be cancelled too." As the passengers of Flight 902 trudged off the plane, angry and sweating, they passed the gate desk. The monitors that usually displayed flight times were now flashing a single ominous message from the airport authority. "Summit Air operations suspended indefinitely. Please contact other carriers." Julian Kincaid was somewhere over the Atlantic, sipping a vintage Pinot Noir and reading a book. He didn't have Wi-Fi turned on. He didn't need to check the score. He knew he had won. London, England. The next morning. The headquarters of Kincaid and Sterling was located in the Shard, piercing the London skyline like a shard of glass. The conference room on the 40th floor offered a panoramic view of the city, but nobody in the room was looking at the view. They were looking at the massive screen at the head of the table. On the screen, via video link from Dallas, was Jonathan Reed, the CEO of Summit Air, and his entire executive team. They looked like they hadn't slept in 24 hours. Their ties were loosened. Their eyes were red, and the background noise of ringing phones was audible even over the video call. In the London conference room sat Arthur Sterling. He was impeccably dressed in a navy suit, calmly stirring his tea. "Mr. Sterling," Reed pleaded, his voice cracking. "Please, you have to lift the freeze. We have planes stranded in 30 countries. We have passengers rioting in terminals. Our stock has dropped 70% in pre-market trading. We are bleeding $50 million an hour. It is a terrible situation, Jonathan," Arthur said, taking a sip of tea. "Truly unfortunate." "It's illegal," Summit's general counsel shouted from the background. This is a predatory breach of contract. We will sue you. Arthur set his cup down. The clink of china on the saucer echoed in the silent room. You won't sue anyone, a deep voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. Julian Kincaid walked in. He looked fresh. He had showered at the BA Arrivals Lounge and changed into a bespoke suit that cost more than Captain Hanson's annual salary. He walked to the head of the table, stood next to Arthur, and looked into the camera. Mr. Kincaid, Reed gasped. Julian, please, let's talk about this. We tried to talk, Julian said. Yesterday, in seat 2A. I believe the consensus was that I was non-compliant and a thug. That was a mistake, Reed stammered. A rogue crew. We've already suspended them. Captain Hanson, Brenda, the gate agent, they're all gone. Fired. Effective immediately. That's a start, Julian said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. But it's not enough. You see, Jonathan, the problem isn't just one crew. It's the culture. You allowed a culture where a diamond medallion card matters more than a human being. You allowed a culture where your staff felt comfortable using police force to rectify a booking error. We will change, Reed promised. We will institute diversity training. We will change the boarding protocols. We will give you a seat on the board. Julian laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound. I don't want a seat on the board, Jonathan. I already own the board. Remember the debt covenants. If your stock price falls below $5 a share, KNS has the right to convert our debt into equity at a discounted rate, effectively taking majority control. Reed went pale. He checked his phone. Summit Air was trading at 420 sounds. You crashed the stock on purpose, Reed whispered. You engineered a hostile takeover. I didn't engineer anything, Julian said, leaning forward. I bought a ticket to London. You crashed the stock. You hired the pilot. You set the policy. I just pulled the loose thread that unraveled your cheap sweater. Julian picked up a document that Arthur had prepared. Here are the terms, Jonathan. Listen closely because I'm only going to say them once. The room in Dallas went deathly silent. 1. Julian listed. Summit Air declares immediate bankruptcy restructuring. Kincaid and Sterling assumes full ownership of the airline's assets. 2. The entire C-suite, that means you, Jonathan, and everyone sitting at that table, resigns without severance. Today. 3. We are rebranding. Summit Air is dead. The toxicity attached to the name is terminal. We will dissolve the brand and sell the fleet. You can't do that, Reed shouted. You're destroying a 50-year-old company. It was destroyed the moment you let prejudice fly the plane, Julian retorted. Do you accept the terms, or do I let the fuel freeze continue until your planes are just scrap metal on the tarmac? Reed looked at his team. He looked at the stock ticker, which was now flashing red at $3.80. He looked at the news, which was showing protests outside their headquarters. He had no cards left to play. We accept, Reed whispered, putting his head in his hands. Good, Julian said. He stood up. Arthur will handle the paperwork. I have a meeting to get to. What meeting? Arthur asked, raising an eyebrow. You just acquired an airline. I have a meeting with the United Negro College Fund, Julian said, buttoning his jacket. I'm going to donate the proceeds from the liquidation of Summit Air's first-class cabins. I think it's time we invested in a future where people are judged by their brilliance, not their boarding group. Julian walked to the door. Before he left, he looked back at the screen at the devastated faces of the men who thought they ran the world. Oh, and Jonathan, Julian said. Reed looked up, tears in his eyes. Tell Mr. Halloway I hope he enjoyed the seat. It cost him his frequent flyer miles. And you, your job. Julian walked out. The heavy oak doors closed behind him with a final resonant thud. The death of a multi-billion-dollar corporation is rarely quiet. It is usually a messy, loud, and prolonged affair, filled with lawyers, liquidators, and the weeping of shareholders. But the erasure of Summit Air was different. It was swift, clinical, and absolute, a masterclass in corporate execution, performed by Kincaid and Sterling. 3 months after the incident at JFK, the physical presence of Summit Air had been scrubbed from the face of the earth. At Terminal 4, the massive navy and gold signage that had once loomed over the check-in counters was gone. In its place stood temporary construction walls, plastered with generic advertisements for credit cards and duty-free cologne. The fleet of Boeing 777s, once the pride of the sky, had been stripped of their livery. They sat in a desert boneyard in Victorville, California, their logos painted over in white, waiting to be chopped up for spare parts or sold to cargo haulers in Eastern Europe. But while the airline was gone, the human wreckage it left behind was still smoldering. Julian Kincaid had promised that karma would be real, and he was a man who audited his promises meticulously. Brenda the purser, who had once wielded her authority like a cudgel, found herself standing in a very different kind of uniform. She was no longer wearing the tailored navy blazer and silk scarf of a senior flight attendant. Instead, she was wearing a bright green apron that smelled faintly of roasted coffee and sanitizer. She was working the morning shift at a generic coffee chain in a strip mall in Queens. It was the only job she could get. The aviation industry is a small world, and the blacklist is real. After the video of her sneering at Julian went viral, racking up 40 million views on TikTok, she became a liability. Delta didn't want her. United didn't want her. Even the budget carriers desperate for staff had flagged her file high-risk public relations hazard. "Excuse me, miss," a customer asked, tapping on the counter. "I ordered this with oat milk." Brenda looked up. Her eyes tired and rimmed with red. She recognized the look on the customer's face. It wasn't just impatience, it was recognition. The customer pulled out her phone, whispering to her friend, "That's her. That's the lady from the plane video." Brenda felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She turned away to remake the drink, her hands shaking. She had lost her seniority, her pension, and her identity. She had spent 20 years building a career, and it had evaporated in 30 seconds because she judged a book by its cover. As she handed the cup over, she saw the customer filming her surreptitiously. Brenda retreated to the back room and wept. There was no first-class cabin to hide in anymore. Captain Greg Hansen sat in the living room of his colonial-style house in New Jersey, staring at a stack of mail on his coffee table. Most of them were envelopes with red stamps. Final notice, past due, legal action imminent. The FAA investigation, triggered by Julian's legal team, had been ruthless. They didn't just look at the incident with Julian. They opened the vault on Hansen's entire 30-year career. They found a pattern of behavior that Summit Air had swept under the rug, skipped safety checklists, bullying of junior officers, and 3 prior complaints of racial bias from passengers that had been lost by HR. His pilot's license hadn't just been suspended, it had been revoked pending a psychiatric and competency review that would take years to complete. At 55 years old, Greg Hansen was grounded for life. A heavy truck rumbled up his driveway. Hansen walked to the window. It was a tow truck. They were backing up to his prized possession, the 30-foot Sea Ray boat named the Captain's Orders. It was the symbol of his status, the toy he used to impress his neighbors. "Hey!" Hansen yelled, running out the front door in his bathrobe. "You can't take that, I'm talking to the bank." The repo man, A burly guy who looked like he'd heard every excuse in the book didn't even look up as he hooked the winch to the boat's trailer. "Bank says talk is cheap, pal. You haven't made a payment in 90 days. Hansen watched as his boat was dragged down the driveway, the hull scraping against the asphalt. His wife stood in the doorway behind him, a suitcase in her hand. She had warned him for years that his arrogance would cost them everything. She wasn't staying to watch the rest of the house get repossessed. Then there was Mr. Halloway, the man who had demanded the seat. The man who had said about time when Julian was escorted off. Halloway had been a senior partner at Vanguard and Price, a prestigious corporate law firm in Manhattan. He was a man who billed $1,200 an hour and specialized in crisis management. But he couldn't manage this crisis. When the identity of the seat stealer was revealed online, Vanguard and Price lost 3 major clients in 48 hours. The clients didn't want a firm associated with a man who became the face of entitlement and bigotry. On a rainy Tuesday, Halloway was summoned to the managing partner's office. He walked in expecting a reprimand. What he found was a cardboard box on the desk. "We're invoking the morality clause in your partnership agreement, Bob," the managing partner said, not even offering him a seat. "You're out, effective immediately. Security will escort you to the elevator." "You can't do this." Halloway sputtered, his face turning the same shade of purple it had on the plane. "I bring in millions." "You brought in millions," the partner corrected. "Now you're a liability. Get out." Halloway walked out of the skyscraper, clutching his box of personal effects into the pouring rain. He tried to hail a cab, but 3 passed him by. He was just another face in the crowd, now stripped of his platinum status. While the antagonists of the story were crumbling, Julian Kincaid was building. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was bathed in warm golden light. It was the night of the inaugural Kincaid Foundation Gala. The room was filled with the titans of industry tech moguls, politicians and philanthropists. But tonight, the guest list was different. Interspersed among the billionaires were 50 young men and women, mostly from underprivileged backgrounds, all wearing crisp new blazers with a golden wing pin on the lapel. Julian stood at the podium. He looked immaculate in a black tuxedo, but his demeanor was humble. Behind him, a massive screen displayed the new logo of his initiative. 3 months ago, Julian began, his voice silencing the room. "I was removed from a flight because I didn't look like I belonged in seat 2A. I was told that my presence was a disruption. I was told to leave." He paused, letting the memory hang in the air. "That Airline Summit Air no longer exists. We liquidated it. We sold every engine, every seat, and every rivet. And tonight I want to show you what we did with the money." Julian gestured to the screen. A graphic appeared, $52,000. "This is the net profit from the death of Summit Air," Julian said. "And every single cent of it is going into the account of the Kincaid Flight Academy." The crowd gasped. This wasn't just a donation, it was a fortune. "We are funding full scholarships for 500 aspiring pilots from marginalized communities." Julian continued, his voice rising with passion. "These are young people who have the brilliance, the discipline, and the dream, but who have been told by society that they don't look the part. Well, from now on, they are the part." He pointed to the front row. "Please stand." The 50 young students stood up. Among them was Leo, the 19-year-old, who had filmed the video. He was beaming tears, streaming down his face. He was no longer just a kid with a smartphone. He was the first recipient of the scholarship, already enrolled in flight school. "These are your future captains," Julian declared, And I promise you this, when you step onto their plane, they will never judge you by your clothes. They will judge you by your character." The room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a thunderous, standing ovation that shook the chandeliers. Later that night, as the gala wound down, Julian stood on the terrace of the hotel, looking out over Central Park. The city lights twinkled below a sprawling grid of ambition and dreams. Arthur Sterling walked up beside him, holding 2 glasses of aged whiskey. "You know," Arthur said, handing a glass to Julian, "I ran the final numbers today. After the legal fees, the severance for the innocent staff, we rehired elsewhere, and the setup of the academy. You actually lost about $4 million of your own money on this deal." Julian took the glass, swirling the amber liquid. He looked at the moon hanging low over the skyline. "I didn't lose anything, Arthur," Julian said softly. "How do you figure the ledger is in the red?" "The ledger is just numbers," Julian corrected. "Think about Holloway. Think of Hanson. Think of Brenda. They spent their whole lives thinking power was something you hoarded, something you used to make other people feel small." Julian turned to look his partner in the eye. "Tonight, 500 kids went to sleep knowing that their dream is possible because a man in a hoodie stood his ground. I bought a future for them, Arthur, and compared to that, $4 million is a bargain." Arthur smiled, clinking his glass against Julian's. "To the future, then?" "To the future," Julian replied, "and to seat 2A. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest. He thought about the next flight he would take. He would wear his hoodie again. He would wear his sneakers. And he dared anyone to tell him he didn't belong. Because the next time someone tried to move him, he wouldn't just buy the airline. He'd buy the airport, in a world obsessed with status. Summit Air forgot the golden rule, humility. They saw a man in a hoodie and saw a problem. They should have seen a king in disguise. Julian Kincaid didn't just take down an airline. He dismantled a system of arrogance. He proved that true power doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to bully, and it certainly doesn't need to wear a suit. True power is knowing your worth and having the courage to stand your ground when the world tries to push you out of your seat. The next time you see someone sitting quietly, remember Julian. Remember that kindness is free, but disrespect can cost you $3 billion. Wow. Talk about instant karma. That is what happens when you mess with the wrong person. What do you think? Did Captain Hanson and Mr. Holloway deserve what they got? Or was Julian too harsh? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. We have plenty more tales of revenge, karma, and drama coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.